I got in touch with a Swedish family one of the members of the family had gone down to fight for ISIS in 2014. I connected with the father of the man who had gone down and spoke to him about what had happened since then. And he opened my eyes to the fact that there were thousands of people still stuck in northeast Syria. I'm Nils Adler, a producer. Thousands of foreign ISIS fighters and their families remain in prisons and detention camps in northeast Syria. But between us, now with the region in flux, that could all change. I reported from around Mosul in northern Iraq back in 2016 when US coalition forces, Iraqi forces and Kurdish forces were fighting for control of the city from ISIS. But in 2019, its caliphate fell and the news cycle moved on. And I think many people assumed the story ended there. However, thousands of people remain in detention centers and prisons in the region. And when there was a change of regime in Damascus, late 2024, I wanted to reconnect with the story and find out what happened to those people in northeast Syria. So I met with the father of the man who had gone down, and he wanted me to meet his son, Damal, and his daughter-in-law, Amina, and her 3 children. I visited Roj camp, effectively an open-air prison in northeast Syria. I spoke to Amina about the conditions there, and she said that the children had lived there for many, many years, and it just simply wasn't a place for children to grow up. It was essential that they should be repatriated. She did have permanent Swedish residency, and she said that the Swedish Foreign Ministry had come and DNA tested the children, and it'd been proven that they were Swedish citizens, but they'd been caught up in bureaucratic wrangling, and the repatriation that would see them come back to Sweden with her had been rejected. She also said, "Can you try and meet my husband in prison?" So I made a request to the authorities. I gave them the name, Damal, of the prisoner that I wanted to meet, and they told me that I could come to a special militarized compound the next day to meet with what they said was a prisoner. Now, when I went to the militarized compound, a man was brought in. He had a bag over his head, he had his hands tied, and he had a jumpsuit on. He was brought in front of me, and the sack was removed from the top of his head. But he introduced himself by another name. Immediately, I was both interested to speak to him, but also disappointed. However, as the conversation progressed, the man mentioned Damal, the prisoner that I had originally come to meet. And he said that he had died many years ago. I felt immediate shock. So there was a lot of confusion in my head. I felt some form of responsibility to find as much information out as possible. So I had to go back to the father of Damal and explain that the prisoner had told me that his son was most likely dead. Now his reaction was, he was understandably incredibly upset, but it kind of turned into incredible frustration with the Swedish authorities because he said he had cooperated with them. It wasn't right that a journalist was returning and telling him that his son was most likely dead. So having looked at the issue of repatriation, I can say every country is different. I specifically dealt with Sweden, and the repatriation process was in many ways inhumane. I met the families of people who both had grandchildren and children in these camps, and they were saying, these children are innocent in all of this. Please do something to repatriate these children. I met with many of these families, and they said there was a distinct difference in how non-ethnic Swedes were being treated. There had been a very famous case of a guy called Mikael Skramo, who is an ethnic Swede who had had many kids down in Syria with another Swedish woman. And those children had been orphaned, he had died, and the grandparents in Sweden had been able to garner a lot of national sympathy through a media campaign to get the children repatriated back to Sweden. However, for the people who weren't ethnically Swedish, and especially those who came from a Muslim background, they said they simply couldn't garner that same sympathy. So with everything in flux in the region, and US President Donald Trump telling interim Syrian President al-Assad that the interim government in Damascus is going to have to take charge of these camps, there is a sense that things are going to change. You have US aid temporarily withdrawing funding and no guarantee that it will remain. You have US troops leaving the region, and now you have a new agreement signed between the SDF and the interim government in Damascus. And everyone I spoke to in the camps said that there was definitely a sense that something is going to have to give in some way.